Hi, my name's Danny. That reminds me that life is a series of experiences that we share. That reminds me of the Sydney Opera House from a boat. That reminds me of a koala. That reminds me of a kangaroo. That reminds me of square rocks creating a jetty in Queensland.
That's the Squeaker Beach.
That reminds me of walking on a beach that had squeaky sand. That reminds me of a lion in a palace in Thailand with perfectly sculpted balls. That reminds me that a bathroom in a Thailand gas station is just a tiled hole. That reminds me of being taxied around in tuk-tuks. That reminds me of the largest lying down Buddha in Thailand. That reminds me of the largest sitting Buddha in Hong Kong. That reminds me of the largest standing Buddha in Thailand. That reminds me of having to take off my shoes in a sacred place, but my skull t-shirt was fine. That reminds me of a guard I was much bigger than. That reminds me of cyanobacteria, the world's oldest living organism. They eat CO2 and make air for us to breathe. That reminds me of eating a meat pie that I had in an airport in Beijing. That reminds me of getting seasick on a boat in the Indian Ocean. That reminds me of a whale shark I saw in the Indian Ocean. That reminds me of a blue whale I saw from a helicopter off the coast of California. That reminds me of dolphins I saw on a ski off the coast of Catalina. That reminds me of being attacked by a giant school of fish. That reminds me of being attacked by a monkey at a temple in India. That reminds me of trying to feed a swan in Switzerland. That reminds me of a banana split I had on a beach in a cafe in Spain. That reminds me of this other tavern that fed me my first wild rabbit. That reminds me of the wild sand dune adventure in Queensland. That reminds me of when I saw an ocean pushing the sand into a rainforest. That reminds me of a lady crashing while sandboarding down a dune. And not crashing myself. I'm awesome. That reminds me of the Tin City in the dunes and a beautiful storm coming in. That reminds me of a warm-up dance at Uluru. That reminds me of running barefoot through the Pinnacle Gardens at sunset. That reminds me of the Hong Kong City light show after sunset. That reminds me of countless adventures in Vegas at night. That reminds me of adventures in Washington, D.C., mostly headstand push-ups in the National Monument and climbing trees. That reminds me of trying to pet a camel in the desert and push car in India. That reminds me of people building a dam with sand in India. That reminds me of scaring a fish. That reminds me of more fish. That reminds me of finding Nemo and his friend the turtle and meeting one face to face 45 feet down on the Great Barrier Reef. That reminds me of sitting on a beach in Goa. That reminds me of visiting Vic in Venice Beach. That reminds me of hanging with Jenny and hanging out with all my friends.
These are my friends.
That reminds me that life is a series of memories that we all experience and share. Thanks for sharing my life with me, YouTube. That was my important work.